The Luger P08 sits in a glass case in a modest home in Pennsylvania, next to a faded photograph of a young man in an army uniform. The pistol is immaculate dark blued steel, checkered walnut grips, the toggle lock mechanism that made it one of the most distinctive sidearms ever designed. Engraved on the backstrap in elegant script is a name, Generalmajor Friedrich von Skell. The man who owns it, 87 years old now, sometimes takes it out and holds it carefully, feeling the weight. He doesn't talk about it much. When he does, he starts the same way every time. I traded 3 packs of Luckies for that. Best deal I ever made. His name is Robert Capa, not the famous photographer. Just a kid from Scranton who happened to share the name. In 1945, he was a 20-year-old private first class in the 3rd Armored Division, and he had no business being anywhere near a German general. But in the chaos of Germany's collapse, the old rules stopped applying. Rank dissolved, hierarchies crumbled, and in the weird liminal space between war and peace, APFC could find himself face-to-face with a general officer who days earlier had commanded thousands of men. And in that moment, cigarettes became currency worth more than gold. The story of that Luger is really the story of 2 worlds colliding, the world of the Wehrmacht with its rigid, disciplined and aristocratic officer class, and the world of the American GI improvising and hustling through a war that never quite matched the training manuals. It's a story about what happens when absolute power meets absolute defeat, about the strange intimacy that can exist between enemies, and about how the detritus of a fallen empire became souvenirs in the pockets of farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. But more than that, it's a window into a moment in history that's often glossed over those final weeks of the European war, when Germany was coming apart at the seams, when millions of soldiers were surrendering faster than the Allies could process them, when the whole elaborate structure of the Third Reich was collapsing into a human flood of refugees, POs, and defeated men trying desperately to survive. In that chaos, cigarettes became the universal language. And a smart GI who understood that could trade his way into a piece of history. April 1945. The 3rd Armored Division was driving deep into Germany, racing toward the Elbe River, where they would eventually meet the Soviets. The German army wasn't so much fighting as disintegrating. Whole units surrendered en masse. Others simply melted away, soldiers discarding uniforms and weapons, trying to blend into the civilian population or just walk home. For the tankers and infantry of the 3rd Armored, the advance had become surreal. Days would pass with barely a shot fired, then suddenly they'd run into a fanatical SS unit that would fight to the last man. Towns surrendered without resistance, white flags hanging from windows. Other villages had to be taken house by house. There was no front line anymore, just a confused zone of advance where anything could happen. Bob Capa's job was assistant driver on an M4 Sherman, which meant he did whatever needed doing, help with maintenance, handle ammunition, pull security, and most importantly, scrounge. Every army runs on logistics, but in the field, it runs on scrounging, acquiring things that aren't in the official supply chain, trading for necessities, improvising solutions to problems that headquarters never anticipated. And the currency of scrounging was cigarettes. The U.S. Army issued cigarettes in rations 4 packs per week per soldier, though the actual distribution varied. For American troops, cigarettes were plentiful, almost throwaway items. A soldier might smoke some, trade some, give some away. The PX sold them cheap. Mail from home often included cartons. But for Germans in 1945, cigarettes were treasure. The economy had collapsed. The Reichsmark was worthless. Food was scarce. Normal commerce had broken down. In this vacuum, cigarettes became the universal medium of exchange, compact, standardized, divisible, and genuinely valuable. You could trade them for food, information, labor, or cooperation. A cigarette could buy a meal. A pack could buy a favor. A carton could buy almost anything. Smart G has figured this out quickly. Bob Capa was smart. He didn't smoke much, never had, so his ration cigarettes accumulated. Other guys in his tank crew would trade him their candy for his smokes. Then trade the smokes to German civilians for eggs, bread, schnapps, whatever they could get. It was a system, unofficial but universal. What Capa didn't expect was that the cigarette economy would extend all the way up the Wehrmacht's chain of command. The encounter happened on April 18th near a town called Gardelegen, about 80 miles west of Berlin. The 3rd Armored had just liberated a barn where SS troops had locked over 1,000 prisoners, slave laborers. Political prisoners, pose and set it on fire. Most died. The survivors were barely human, skeletal figures in rags. The G is who found them were physically sick. Several tank crews disobeyed orders and went hunting for the SS unit responsible, killing the prisoners they took. In this atmosphere of rage and horror, a German column approached under a white flag. Not SS Wehrmacht regular army, about 200 men from a panzer division that had been cut off and surrounded. They wanted to surrender, but specifically to the Americans, not the Soviets. They'd been trying to move west for days, dodging SS units that would shoot them for desertion and Soviet advance guards that would send them to Siberian camps. Leading them was Generalmajor Friedrich von Skell, a career officer, 52 years old, who'd commanded armor units since 1942. He was everything the American G's weren't: Prussian military aristocracy, old-school professional soldier, a man who'd grown up in a world of rigid hierarchies and codes of honor that now lay in ruins around him. When von Skell's column halted, an American lieutenant went forward to accept the surrender. Kappa's tank was part of the security detail, spread out with guns covering the Germans in case it was a trick. It wasn't. The Wehrmacht soldiers were exhausted, hungry, demoralized. Many were wounded. They dropped their weapons in a pile: rifles, machine guns, Panzerfausts. Officers unbuckled their pistol belts and laid them on top. Standard procedure was to search the prisoners, collect valuables and weapons, then send them to the rear for processing. But there were only about 30 Americans present and 200 Germans. And the Americans were more interested in making sure this wasn't an ambush than in thoroughly searching every prisoner. Which is how von Skell managed to keep his Luger. The Wehrmacht had complex regulations about officer sidearms. The Luger P08 was officially being phased out in favor of the simpler, cheaper Walther P38, but many senior officers still carried Lugers, especially presentation pieces or family heirlooms. Von Skell's pistol had been his father's, carried in the First World War, then passed down. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of lineage, tradition, the continuity of Prussian military culture. He should have surrendered it immediately. But in the confusion of the surrender, with hundreds of weapons being piled up and men being searched haphazardly, he managed to slip the Luger into his pack before anyone noticed. It was a small act of rebellion, a refusal to completely submit, to preserve one last connection to what he'd been. The German prisoners were marched to a temporary collection point, field about a mile away where other captured units were being held pending transport to POW camps. There were already several thousand prisoners there, guarded by a handful of American MPs who were completely overwhelmed. The sheer numbers made close supervision impossible. Prisoners sat in groups, talking quietly, smoking if they had tobacco, waiting with the patience of men who no longer controlled their own fate. The Americans set up a perimeter, established checkpoints, and mostly let the Germans self-organize. There was no violence, no escape attempts. Where would they go? Germany was finished. These men knew it. They just wanted to survive, get home eventually, try to salvage something from the catastrophe. Bob Kappa's tank crew was assigned perimeter duty for the afternoon, then rotated back to the company area for the night. Before they left, Kappa did what he always did. He walked the fence line, looking to trade cigarettes for souvenirs. The souvenir hunting had started in France and intensified in Germany. American soldiers were obsessed with it: German helmets, daggers, medals, flags, anything that could be taken home as proof of service and victory. An SS dagger could be traded for a month's worth of cigarettes. An Iron Cross was worth a carton. A Luger was the prize. Every GI wanted one, but they were rare. Officers carried them, and officers usually were processed more carefully, their weapons confiscated officially and properly logged. Kappa had already acquired a decent collection: a Wehrmacht belt buckle, a few medals, a Hitler Youth knife. Nothing spectacular, but tradable. He'd learned that the key was approaching German prisoners who looked desperate, hungry, out of cigarettes, willing to part with anything for a smoke. He spotted von Skell sitting apart from the enlisted men, back against a fence post, eyes closed. The general's S uniform was dirty but still recognizable by its cut and the insignia that hadn't been removed yet. Generals were rare in the POW cages. Most of the senior officers had been captured early in the encirclement, or had managed to escape east. Kappa almost walked past. Officers were tricky. Some still acted superior, refused to deal with enlisted men, especially enemy enlisted men. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the general's posture, the visible exhaustion, the sense that this was a man at the absolute end of his resources. Zigaretten? Kappa said, holding up a pack of Lucky Strikes. Von Scal opened his eyes. For a moment, he just looked at the young American barely more than a boy. Really, in an ill-fitting uniform holding out cigarettes like a peace offering. The absurdity of the situation must have struck him. A week ago, he'd commanded a division. Now he was begging cigarettes from a PFC. Yeah, he said quietly. Danke. Kappa pulled out a cigarette, handed it over along with a lighter. Von Scal lit it, inhaled deeply, closed his eyes again. The tobacco was American, smooth and strong, nothing like the ersatz garbage the Wehrmacht had been issuing toward the end. For a moment, he just savored it. Kappa waited. This was the game: give one cigarette free, establish goodwill, then negotiate. He'd done it dozens of times. You speak English? Kappa asked. Some, Von Scal replied, accented but understandable. Many Wehrmacht officers had learned English in school before the war. You want trade? Yeah. What you got? Von Scal looked at him, calculating. He had nothing of value left except the Luger, and he'd hidden it specifically to avoid losing it. But he was desperately hungry, hadn't eaten in 2 days except for some bread scavenged from a destroyed bakery. The Americans fed their prisoners. Geneva Convention and American abundance meant. Poes got rations, but the food distribution at this overcrowded collection point was chaotic. You could wait hours for a meal that might never come. I have pistol, Von Scal said quietly. Luger, my father's. Kappa's eyes widened slightly. A Luger, from a general. This wasn't just a souvenir, this was the souvenir. He tried to keep his voice casual. Yeah? Let me see it. Von Scal hesitated, then reached into his pack and carefully pulled out the pistol, keeping it low so the guards wouldn't see. He handed it over. Kappa examined it with the care of someone who knew weapons. The toggle was smooth, the bluing intact, the grips original. On the backstrap, the engraving, Generalmajor Friedrich von Scal, and below that, a date, 1918. This pistol had survived one world war and most of another. How much? Kappa asked. Food, Von Scal said, and cigarettes. Many cigarettes, Kappa thought fast. He had 3 packs of Luckies on him, part of his ration he'd been saving for trading. In his tank, he had maybe 2 more cartons stashed. In terms of dollar value, negligible cigarettes cost pennies at the PX. But in terms of trade value here, substantial. 3 packs now, Kappa said. I'll bring more tomorrow. And I'll get you food tonight. Von Scal studied him. Could he trust this American boy? Did he have a choice? The Luger was all he had left of his old life, but that life was over. He needed to survive this new reality, and in this reality, cigarettes were survival. Okay, he said finally. Kappa handed over the 3 packs, took the Luger, and slipped it into his jacket. The whole transaction had taken maybe 2 minutes. Around them, hundreds of German prisoners sat in the late afternoon sun, waiting for a future they couldn't imagine, while American guards patrolled with bored efficiency, and in the distance, artillery rumbled as the war continued its final convulsions. Neither man said anything else. There was nothing to say. Von Scal lit another cigarette from the pack Kappa had given him. Kappa walked back toward his tank, the Luger heavy in his jacket, his heart pounding. He'd traded cigarettes worth maybe 50 cents for a piece of history. That night, Kappa did something he didn't have to do. He made good on his promise. He scrounged extra K rations from the company supply, added 2 more packs of cigarettes, and walked back to the POW cage in the dark. The guards knew him by now. He was the kid who traded cigarettes, harmless, and they let him through with minimal questions. He found Von Scal in the same spot, sitting alone. Without a word, Kappa handed over the rations and cigarettes. Von Scal looked surprised, genuinely surprised, and for the first time, something like respect crossed his face. You keep your word, Von Scal said. Yeah, well, Kappa shrugged. Deal's a deal. They talked for a while, awkward conversation between enemies who weren't enemies anymore. Von Scal's English was better than he'd initially let on, good enough to tell his story, or parts of it. He'd been a professional soldier since 1920, had served in Poland, France, Russia. He described the Eastern Front with a haunted look, the retreat from Moscow, the grinding horror of Stalingrad. He didn't mention the Holocaust, the atrocities. Either he didn't know, or he wouldn't admit knowing. Many Wehrmacht officers would claim ignorance after the war, and some genuinely were insulated from the SS's worst crimes. Others chose not to see. Kappa told his own story growing up in Pennsylvania, the Depression, enlisting in 1943 because it seemed better than the mines. Crossing the Atlantic on a troopship, landing in France 2 months after D-Day, the push across Europe. He was matter-of-fact about it, the way young men are about experiences they haven't yet processed. What struck both of them, though neither said it directly, was how ordinary they were. Von Skell wasn't a Nazi fanatic. He was a career officer who deserved his country, and found himself on the wrong side of history. Kappa wasn't a hero, he was a working-class kid doing a job. In another world, they might have had nothing to say to each other. In this world, they were two men sitting in the ruins of Germany, sharing cigarettes and trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. Before Kappa left, Von Skell asked a question that clearly mattered to him. "The pistol, you will keep it? Not sell it?" "I'll keep it," Kappa promised. "My grandkids will see it someday." Von Skell nodded, satisfied. The Luger would continue even if everything else was lost. They never saw each other again. The next day, Von Skell's group was trucked to a larger POW camp for processing. He spent 2 years in American custody, then was released and returned to what was left of Germany. He died in 1963, having never spoken publicly about his wartime service. His family, a daughter, some grandchildren, knew almost nothing about him. The past was something post-war Germans often buried. Kappa returned home in late 1945, the Luger carefully packed in his duffel. He never sold it, despite offers over the years from collectors who recognized its value. It sat in a drawer for decades, taken out occasionally when old army buddies visited and they'd swap stories, but mostly forgotten as life moved on: marriage, kids, work at the steel mill, retirement. But the Luger represented something Kappa only understood years later. It was proof of a moment when the grand narratives of the war nations and ideologies and historical forces came down to two men negotiating over cigarettes. It was proof that even in total war, humanity persisted in small transactions. Private mercies. The maintenance of something like honor between enemies. The cigarette economy of 1945 Germany was vast, touching millions of lives. At the macro level, it represented the collapse of normal currency and the improvisation of a barter system. At the micro level, it was Kappa and Von Skell in a prison cage, working out a trade. Other G's had similar stories, trading cigarettes for cognac in French cellars, for watches from desperate Germans, for information from civilians who knew where weapons were hidden. Some of these trades were exploitative, Americans using their advantage to squeeze desperate people. Others were more equitable, genuine exchanges between people trying to get by. The military officially discouraged fraternization and trading, but enforcement was haphazard. Officers often looked the other way. Recognizing that the cigarette economy served useful purposes, it gave G's something to do, provided intelligence and cooperation from civilians, and imposed a kind of order on the chaos. The souvenirs made their way home in the millions: helmets and daggers and medals and pistols, each one carrying a story, most of the stories forgotten as the men who brought them home aged and died. Attics and basements across America filled with relics of the war, slowly becoming antiques, then collectibles, then just mysterious objects that grandchildren found and wondered about. Some of the souvenirs were valuable Nazi flags, SS items, officers' swords. Many were essentially worthless, mass-produced items kept for sentimental reasons. But all of them represented the same thing: proof of presence. Tangible evidence that a farm boy from Nebraska or a factory worker from Detroit had been there, had seen history, had taken a piece of it home. The Luger was special because of its provenance, a general's sidearm, engraved with a documented history. But in another sense, it was utterly typical. It was war reduced to its human scale, the grand sweep of armies and nations coming down to a transaction between two tired men who just wanted to get through the day. In 2003, a collector contacted Kappa with an offer. He'd been researching Wehrmacht generals and had come across references to Von Skell. He knew about the Luger. Kappa had mentioned it in an interview for a local historical society years earlier, and he wanted to buy it. He offered $5,000, then $10,000 when Kappa refused. Kappa said no. Not because the money wouldn't be useful, he was retired on a fixed income. The money would help. He said no because selling it would violate the promise he'd made in a German prison cage in 1945. The Luger was supposed to stay in the family. That was the deal. His granddaughter, a history teacher, eventually convinced him to donate it to a museum instead of keeping it in a drawer. It's now part of a World War II collection at a small museum in Pennsylvania, displayed with Kappa's uniform, some photographs, and a typed card explaining its history. Most visitors walk past without much interest. There are flashier exhibits, more dramatic artifacts. But occasionally, someone stops and reads the card, and they see what the Luger represents, the human dimension of history, the small transactions that run beneath the grand narratives. The story of Bob Kappa and Friedrich von Schell is one of millions from World War II, most of them lost to time. The war produced vast historical records, battle reports, casualty figures, strategic analyses, but individual moments between people often went unrecorded. A trade of cigarettes for a pistol didn't make it into official histories, didn't factor into operational summaries, wasn't considered significant by anyone except the two men involved. Yet these moments mattered because they revealed the texture of the war as it was actually experienced. For all the planning and strategy and high-level decision-making, the war on the ground was improvised, personal, and often absurd. A general reduced to trading family heirlooms for cigarettes. APFC negotiating with his enemy over rations and tobacco. These weren't the stories taught in history classes, but they were the stories men actually lived. The cigarette economy itself faded quickly. By 1948, currency reform had stabilized the German economy. The Deutschmark replaced the worthless Reichsmark. Normal commerce resumed. Cigarettes went back to being just cigarettes, not the universal medium of exchange. The bizarre interim period when lucky strikes were more valuable than gold became a strange memory, something old men would mention to skeptical grandchildren who couldn't imagine a world where that made sense. But for those who lived through it, the cigarette economy was unforgettable. It represented the collapse of normal social order and the emergence of improvised systems. It showed how quickly humans adapt, creating new structures when old ones fail. And it demonstrated the power of small, portable, divisible commodities to serve as currency when nothing else works. Military historians studying logistics sometimes overlook these informal economies, focusing on official supply chains and requisition systems. But the informal side mattered enormously. The cigarette ration wasn't just about providing soldiers with tobacco, it was about giving them trading capital, a way to acquire things the army didn't supply, to negotiate with civilians, to smooth interactions in occupied territory. American abundance made the system work. The U.S. produced so many cigarettes that they could be issued freely to soldiers and still remain valuable in trade. German or Soviet soldiers couldn't play the same game. Their cigarette rations were too meager, too irregular. Only the Americans had enough surplus to use tobacco as currency. This reflected broader patterns. American logistics throughout the war operated with a margin of excess that other nations couldn't match. There was waste, certainly supplies destroyed, equipment abandoned, resources used inefficiently. But the waste was affordable, and it bought flexibility. An American unit could afford to be generous with cigarettes and rations because more were always coming. That generosity, in turn, bought cooperation, intelligence, and goodwill that had strategic value even if it never appeared in official accounting. When Kappa died in 2019, his obituary in the local paper mentioned his war service but not the Luger. The funeral was small, a few family members, some old friends, no media attention. He wasn't famous, had done nothing that would make history books. He was just one of 16 million Americans who served in World War II, most of whom returned home and lived quiet lives. But the Luger remains in its museum case, a silent witness to a moment of human connection in the midst of history's most destructive war. Visitors can see it if they stop and look: the dark steel, the toggle mechanism, the engraved name, Generalmajor Friedrich von Schell. And if they read the card, they learn that it was traded for 3 packs of Lucky Strikes by a PFC from Scranton, who understood that in the ruins of Germany in 1945, cigarettes were worth more than rank, more than ideology, more than all the grand causes that had driven millions to kill each other. Sometimes history is made by generals and politicians, by strategic decisions and battlefield victories. And sometimes it's made in a prison cage, by 2 tired men working out a trade, finding a moment of mutual respect amid the wreckage of a world that had lost its mind. The Luger sits in its case, still functional, still bearing its history. It crossed the Atlantic in a GI's duffel bag, sat in a drawer for decades. Now rests under glass where occasionally someone pauses to wonder about the men whose lives intersected for a few minutes in April 1945. 3 packs of cigarettes. A general's pistol, a promise kept across 70 years. In the vast scope of World War II, it's almost nothing, a footnote to a footnote. Utterly insignificant to the strategic outcome. And yet it's everything, a reminder that beneath the armies and ideologies and historical forces, the war was experienced by individuals, moment by moment, decision by decision, transaction by transaction. History at human scale, where a deal is still a deal, even between enemies. Even in the ruins of the Third Reich, the GI who traded cigarettes for a Nazi generals, Luger did something unremarkable and something profound. He participated in the great informal economy that emerged from Europe's collapse. He acquired a souvenir that would outlive him. And he kept his word to a defeated enemy, honoring a promise made when promises no longer mattered to anyone except the two men involved. That's worth remembering. Not because it changed the war's outcome, it didn't, but because it reveals the war's human dimension, the texture of lived experience that official histories often miss. And because it demonstrates that even in total war, even in absolute defeat, some things persist. The need for connection, the possibility of honor, the small mercies that make survival bearable. The Luger is proof of that. And the story behind it, 3 packs of lucky strikes and a promise kept, is worth more than the pistol's market value, more than its historical significance, more than anything that can be measured or priced. It's a piece of truth about how wars are actually fought and survived, not just with weapons and strategy, but with improvisation and trade, with small kindnesses between enemies, with the preservation of humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it.